Good to see all of you all tonight, or at least see a couple of you tonight. Some of you continue to hide, so we'll maybe see you at some point. This is the last class, and if you've ever had one of those courses, either on a high school or college level, where there was a review of the course at the end of the course, I always liked those because in some ways they gave me a chance to test what I had learned. And so that's kind of going to be what tonight is about. What is stuck with you? What has made an impression on you? So let's jump right in. As you see, we've got probably more material tonight than we have time to cover. But I want to begin, before we get into the question itself, with a verse that I think has relevance to this, that you may not think about when you read this verse. This is James 1:17. James says, "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." As I prepared for this class, one of the things that stood out to me for this particular class session, is the idea of what a gift God has given. And so I wanted to start out the class tonight emphasizing that the gift, that intimacy, sexual intimacy between a husband and wife is a gift. And that's going to come up several times as a theme, I think, tonight. And at least it will from me. And we will talk about that some more then. So we've spent 10 weeks discussing one of the most controversial books of the Bible. And you'll remember we've talked about some of the controversy, whether it should be included in the canon, how to interpret it, who's talking when, lots of things that there are questions about related to this book that I hope we have had a better understanding about. So what are the lessons and takeaways that stood out to you? Jump in with your greatest takeaways from the 10 weeks.
For me, I'd have to say that it was the language that is used for intimacy. It was different to see a healthy view or a godly view of intimacy, which is, I mean, I've never read this book before then, but that was kind of interesting for me to see, just the whole overview.
Yeah, and I've appreciated, Josh, through the weeks, how open you have been about comparing what you have encountered and experienced, how sex has been talked about with what we were seeing in God's Word. And so I appreciate you mentioning that again tonight. Who else?
My biggest takeaway is when Lori introduced you as Dr. Love.
Let's never forget that. Okay, let's never ever forget that.
I'll never forget that. It's hard for me to look at you anymore.
Oh, you're going to be really uncomfortable then when we see each other in person again, I guess.
Well, for me, the real biggest takeaway is that especially in our society where everything's up close and personal in your face, is that we have such a convoluted text and context of what love and sexual intimacy is about.
Yeah.
And it has convoluted our feelings, I'm sure, as adults. It's been really interesting to look at some of the younger people's take in regard to where it is. And I apologize for the puppy.
Well, I was trying to figure out where that was coming from because we've got
our dog hears
here.
it. Our dog was hearing it.
When Linda leaves the room, and she just left, I guess she was blushing. But when she left the room, the puppy whines for her. So I'm going
Okay,
to mute myself.
I relate to that. So you're exactly right, Steve. Comparing and what you said is similar to what Josh said, comparing the healthy view that God has against understanding what the world sees as how to view love, how to view sex is a dramatic contrast. One more. What stood out to you?
This is kind of in line with what both of the others have said too, but I wrote down the importance of guarding our hearts. And, when we were talking about, making sure that everything happens in the proper timing and that we value each other. And, you think about Solomon's, the way that he rudimentarily treated his harem. That's not something that we should engage in, and it's something that's the world tempts us to do. But just that consistent call back to purity, the purity of the of the sexual relationship, I think is just really valuable. And then another thing, sort of unrelated, but talking about communication about sex is, I feel like that's just one of the cornerstones of it. And I really appreciate the way that we've talked through that a lot in this course.
Yeah, and I'm imagining that some of you probably heard me say some things along the 10 weeks, and so, ooh, I've never heard anybody talk like that in Bible class. But where else are we going to learn it? Where else are we going to, I mean, the world will talk about it. The world will talk openly about it. It just won't come from a godly perspective. And so we need to be able to talk in healthy ways about something that God created. And so let me tell you my greatest takeaway, and it gets back to what I said earlier. It is that God is good and that he delights in us enjoying the gifts that he gives. And so we should do that unashamedly, uninhibitedly, within the boundaries of marriage. And so I hope that kind of healthy enjoyment of marriage is one of the things that rings true for you in this class.
Hey,
Second question, I often picture Laurie and I as an old couple, like tomorrow, sitting on our front porch trying to influence others for Christ, that our marriage is a vehicle to carry out the mission of Christ. What did you learn about God's will and purposes for marriage, particularly when it comes to sex?
I think sex highlights several different things, or it gives us the opportunity to engage God in a way that brings us into deeper relationship with him. But it helps us to become more selfless, to appreciate beauty more, to become unified. And then also, I think it allows us the opportunity to grow in ways that we might not realize, because we have to pay such close attention to the way things change, and the value of sex and the value of the other person that we're in a married relationship with, and then the value of God and that he inherently places on us. And so I feel like God's will and purpose for sex is really for like the betterment of our lives overall.
It sounds, Andrea, like you're saying in many ways that the intentionality to the relationship, especially the sexual aspect of it, helps us grow as people. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Yeah, and I hadn't thought about it in those kinds of terms either, but I think that's a very good point. Others, What'd you learn about God's will and purpose for marriage?
Well, I think it can be used as a divisive tool. I think it has to be used as a unity building exercise between a man and woman to understand how the other mate views sexual relationship. It has to grow you into one person, which means we have to spend some time talking about it. And I'm saying really deeply talking about it, understanding how our mate feels, understand how we feel, then utilize it as something that was intended to be as beautiful and not as a tool to withhold or tool to punish, but something that unifies you and that is really special in the sight of God.
Yeah, marriage was never meant to be a tool of leverage in order to get one's way. It was always meant to be God's, to use Steve's words, unifier in the marriage relationship. Marriage is, as you remember me saying, is meant for companionship, but children of God is the lasting relationship that we have with our spouse. Remember us talking about that sex is meant to deeply bind a couple and is deeply nourishing to the psyche of each one when each approaches it with a desire to give and receive fully. And so it is not just a physical release. It is not just the means of procreation. It is also something that does something psychologically, especially I think for men. I guess the reason I say it so tentatively is because I can speak as a man. I can't really speak for a woman, for women on this because I'm not a woman. But as I've talked about earlier, it is a huge deal when a husband comes to his wife wanting that kind of acceptance physically, but it has emotional significance to it for a man. And to be rejected is tremendously painful for a man. And so I hope I've emphasized the importance of that. So being responsive, and I think that's why Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7, he said, your body doesn't, when you're married, your body doesn't really belong to you anymore. You have now gifted it to your spouse. And taking that seriously is something that will, again, bless couples. Other thoughts before we go on?
Dale, I was thinking that it's something that really stood out to me, and I'd heard it before, but that our spiritual relationship, when we are both unified in our, our love for God and everything, it makes a sexual relationship that much better, but it works the other way too. So it just makes everything so much better when we're both on the same level with our love for God. It just improves everything so much more.
Yes, absolutely. So it's hard. The reason sex oftentimes is misused or abused is because of what Maria is talking about. It is divorced from God. It becomes something that's simply physical. It becomes something that is simply selfish or self-fulfilling, rather than something that is a gift from God to be enjoyed for a husband and wife, to bless each other. So again, that it is enriched by that relationship with God. All right. Boy Wallace, and I don't know how many of you know who that is, and it doesn't really matter how many. He was an old Texas preacher who actually came to Virginia when I was, I don't know, a teenager or maybe even younger. He was in his 80s when he held a gospel meeting for my little rural church when I was a child. I don't remember a thing he said except that he preached for 2 hours at least. But I do remember him carrying his infirmed wife with him in his 80s everywhere he went. She was pretty thin by that time, so she didn't weigh a whole lot. But for a man in his 80s to be carrying his wife around was a pretty big, impressive thing. I didn't always agree with his theology or harsh approach, but his commitment to his wife was remarkable. What we learned is the key to committed, lasting relationships. We spent a whole lesson on that. And what you remember is the key to committed, lasting relationships.
I think, like we said earlier, the word intentionality, but making the decision to love and then making little decisions after that, little actions that reflect the big decision. So letting everything go back to that, like being motivated by the decision to love even when it's hard.
Yeah, you remember us reading 1 Corinthians 13 where Paul says love never fails. It's that ability of love to persevere through disappointment, through hard times, through misunderstandings, through offenses, so that you can forgive and be able to move forward. And I'm afraid that some people terminate before they have a chance for love to do its amazing work. And that's that basis of a loving friendship is critical for the lasting nature of a marriage. You nurture it with sex. You see one another as supporters going to heaven, but it is based on that friendship that allows the relationship to be sustained. Other thoughts? Okay. Solomon was an intruder, a villain in maybe I should say my interpretation of the book. What did we learn about the power and possessiveness of sex, particularly from the way Solomon had his harem of 1,000 women? What did we learn about how sex can be a tool of power and possessiveness?
What we talked about Solomon and how he was forceful and demanding, and it makes me think that forcefulness is not the way to enjoy a fulfilling sex life. And we can also see how it wasn't fulfilling, yet I guess he used he uses his power to, I guess, to enjoy what he thought was to enjoy these women, yet it wasn't the enjoyment that God intends for us to ultimately have with one another.
Yeah. Something that stood out to me was how Beloved told Lover that she wanted to be a seal around his heart and a badge. Like she gave herself to him because of his gentleness and because of that protection she felt. But Solomon had to force it out of the women. So I think, I agree with what Trent's saying, that if that possessiveness and forcefulness is what's driving it, it's not going to be the fullness and the richness of what it was intended to be.
I don't know that, I mean, I know none of us in this class tonight can relate to Solomon's position. But can you imagine how unfulfilling it would be in your marriage if your husband or your wife just was interested in their own physical fulfillment, and that's all that the sexual relationship was? How empty it would feel. And so I'm imagining that that beloved and all of the other members of the harem, again, they were objects. They were objects that Solomon used for selfish pleasure. And after they were done, it was empty. So sex can be used as a weapon to control people. That you can simply use people as objects for your pleasure. And these misuses are outside of God's plan. And for very good reason, because they're not loving, they're not relationship building. And that's why they're things that would be against God's will. Other thoughts? What did we learn about beauty? Andrea alluded to beauty a little bit earlier. What did we learn about beauty in this? And what was it based on? Let's start there. We talked about beauty in one lesson particularly. Why did we bring the subject of beauty up?
Wasn't I don't know if this is right, but Beloved was they were both describing each other using weird imagery, and so that's how we kind of got on the subject of it.
Weird imagery?
I mean,
I've been trying it out on Laurie. She thinks it's beautiful.
Well, I mean, yeah, beautiful. I guess I should say not contemporary. Sorry, not weird, not weird.
All right.
But
Not too many gazelles in Lubbock.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, that's why I think that's why we brought it up, isn't it?
You're exactly right. Both beloved and lover use language, weird language, to describe one another's body. But it was intended to be a description that was beautiful and admiring and approving. So that's how we got started talking about beauty, by those descriptive terms that were used, those poetic terms that were used by lover and beloved. So what did we learn about beauty?
It's so much deeper than just somebody's good looking, or I find them attractive or something like that. I remember you saying that you were speaking to the men at this point, and you said that women don't particularly look to see if you've got the square jaw and the nice hair, all that. They're looking for your aura and pretty much how you carry yourself as a man. And so I guess in that sense, it's not the physical. I mean, even if it is physical, it's deeper than just you're pretty. You're using nature. He was using nature to describe his lover, and she was doing the same thing. And so anyway, just kind of that deep, intimate description.
Very good, Josh. Laurie even kind of affirmed that this week. in some of our discussions about, again, it's not that she is not attracted to appearances, but it is the person that has even more significance. I'll remind you, when we read this, when we talked about beauty, 1 Peter chapter 3, where Peter said to wives, he said, don't let your emphasis be on outward beauty. Develop an inner beauty, which is very pleasing to God, is what it says. And so it's God's will. I mean, God created us to see a certain beauty in one another. And so it should be appreciated, it should be affirmed, it is God given. But God even wants us to develop an inner beauty beyond the outward beauty. Okay. Next question. What does it mean for sex to be uninhibited? Now, I think that a lot of people, Christians, especially those who came up in homes that were very, maybe, I'm trying to say this in a very nice way, that were, that's not in a very nice way, suspicious of sex and didn't talk about it much. What does it mean for sex to be uninhibited?
I guess I would say for it to be talked about freely in this manner that we talk about it. I bet you. I grew up in one of those households where it was not really talked about a whole lot. It was just kind of, not really a subject, but uninhibited. I remember you saying that you talked to your sons about it, and just it shouldn't be something that that they felt like you wanted them to feel like they could bring it up whenever they needed to, and so they that way kind of uninhibited in that way.
Yeah, in fact, I think I had a discussion with, at least I know all the boys, and I think I even approached Sarah and maybe even my son-in-law right before they got married and said, hey, do you have questions? What do you want to know? And this is in addition to their premarital counseling. I wanted them talking particularly or thinking particularly about their honeymoon night. And so I wanted them to ask, and I remember telling, Jordan was the most recent, but I remember telling him specifically, because he did have questions, that you've got a lifetime together. Don't be in a rush. Be slow, get to know each other's bodies, talk about things openly. Those are some of the things that I said to him, which is, again, just to be candid with you, a far cry from what our honeymoon night was, because nobody had those conversations with me. So sex is going to be, there are couples in their 90s who are still engaged sexually. And so if you're going to be sharing the marriage and sexual joy for several decades, take your time, get to know each other physically and enjoy it. In fact, I wrote it down this way. Within marriage, a couple is free to enjoy one another, immersing and consuming without reservation, as long as they don't introduce outsiders into their sacred relationship. Experiment, be naked and feel no shame. That is what I want to encourage. And as I said in one of the earlier classes too, I think if we had that kind of openness and that kind of freedom to enjoy, I think that a lot of the sexual temptations that people deal with wouldn't be as difficult. I'm not saying they would go away, but I think that a lot of people are still affected by I want to use prudishness, but I don't know that that's even the right term. It's the unhealthy view of sexuality, the repression of sexuality actually works against healthy sexuality, if that makes sense. Other comments? Anybody else want to talk about uninhibited sex? All right, 3 times in the book, it says, do not arouse or awaken love until it's time. What does the repeated warning mean? What do we learn about that?
Not to awaken it before it's ready. I think that kind of goes back to your question about the power of sex. And she warns constantly not to, or those 3 times, don't awaken it too early.
Yeah, sex is to be practiced within the limits that God has put in place, and there are consequences if you don't. So there's a right time, there's a right place, which is marriage. And I know that as I teach the subject of sexuality, I often have to also add in what people who have maybe not respected that warning, to talk about God's forgiveness and just starting anew where they are with following God's will. So the warning is there because there's an understanding of the implications and consequences of not practicing sexuality within God's limits. Other thoughts? What's the difference between worldly love and godly love? Steve talked about that at the beginning, about what the difference between how the world sees love and how love is presented here. So what's the difference between worldly love and godly love?
One is very self-seeking, what I want, what I think I need. The other seeks what is in the best interest of the other.
Okay, so one fundamental difference is worldly love is self-seeking. What can you do for me? What can you give me? Where godly love is a giving, selfless love. What else?
I think that worldly love a lot of times defines feelings. And when you talk about love, whether it be our love for God or love for each other, sometimes in marriage you have conflict, and we also talked a lot about that. And I feel like that's one difference between worldly love, is that it's cheapened, and a lot of times it's kind of thrown away. Like let's start over. Where godly love, you're in that committed relationship with one another, and you continue to center your life on God and one another, and work through things, and continue to work on your sex life, and it continues to. I mean, it's a good thing to follow that path.
So,
And
so worldly love is discardable. Godly love is persevering. That's
for me, Dale,
yeah.
even though I think I may be using this out of context, but godly love is infinite and required action. It's a verb. It requires not just a feeling.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of times worldly love is about a feeling. I have feelings, and when those feelings are not nurtured, or you don't nurture my feelings, and I stop feeling that I'm in love with you. Whereas God's love is infinite, goes on and on and on and on and on, and requires action on our part, or certainly on God's part, and then our part.
First John says this is how we know love, and then it talks about Christ being sacrificed on the cross. That's the definition of godly love. It's sacrificial. It is selfless. Whereas worldly love is, again, selfish. It is conditional. And godly love is as unconditional as we humans can make it. I don't know that we can truly achieve godlike unconditional love, but it can be as unconditional as we as humans can make it. What is the how did this study affect your view of God? That I'm very curious about, because again, the content was sexual intimacy. So how did this study affect your view of God?
Well, from my perspective, and having grandchildren in the context of this, I mean, I found myself kind of blushing throughout this, because I think early on, I came from a family, we just didn't talk about sex. And if it was taboo, and you're just not supposed to talk about it. You're not supposed to do anything with it. And so one of the things that I come to realize is that God expects a healthy sexual relationship between a man and a woman. That's the first thing. But the second thing, I think he's charged us as Christians and as a church to teach our young marrieds and our kids about a healthy sexual relationship. Growing up, we didn't talk about it in church. And I know Texas has just, I think, adopted the new sex education content for the coming 3 or 4 years. And I haven't dwelled deep enough in. I've looked at it, but it's not the healthy context of what we should be teaching our youth and our parents at Greenlawn. And so my concept of what God would like us to do, and I hope you could take this back potentially to the elders and the parents, is to say, hey, we need classes for our parents in the Song of Solomon. Certainly those deep, intimate relationships that you as a parent need to be an example for your kids. And then we've got to get our kids into this early. We can't wait till they're seniors in high school. My 10-year-old grandson had a conversation with his mother the other day. I happened to be in a room. He said, Mom, when are you going to talk to me about puberty? She said, I'm not, but your pawpaw is. And he said, well, that kind of creeps me out. It kind of creeps me out talking about puberty with my grandson. So what I'm telling you is, I wish I'd have had this. I wish it, I wish it Andre and Trent's age, I wish I'd had it. And I wish someone had been there to talk to my kids, or taught me how to talk to my kids. Because if we don't, they're going to learn it from the world view, not the godly view, the world view. So it's kind of how I feel about it. God wants us to talk about this. God emphasizes it, or he wouldn't have put this book in the canon.
Thank you for saying all this, and I'd encourage you to encourage the elders to say that. I have taught a couple of times classes for parents about how to talk to your kids about sex, but it's been a long time, and I try to preach on the subject periodically. But you're right. it has been taboo, and I don't, I'm not going to let it be taboo, if I can help it.
Well, it's been a blessing to me. I hope it's been a way. She's been here every night that I've been here, so it's been a blessing. I appreciate it. And we're well beyond that puberty talk of age with our kids and even with our grandkids. But we needed this lesson, I'll tell you that.
Wonderful.
It also
Thank
is
you.
very imperative that we take the ownership as a congregation to talk to our youth, not the schools. I know the schools are going to do it, but they're going to learn it in the locker room and places where they don't need it. It's going to continue to be taboo unless we as a congregation embrace it and really talk about it. And you've done a wonderful job of teaching me that healthy relationship.
Thank you. Thank you. Keep preaching, brother. Others, what did you learn about God through this?
I would say I learned about how intimate God wants us to be. And it, I came to more appreciate just how much, you just realize how human, or I just realized how human I am and how good God is, with this book being in the Bible. Like Steve said, I mean, I blushed too, even just reading some of it. And, I just learned more about how intimate God is and how he wants us to be, and how you brought it up one class that it's kind of like a brotherly sister, brother sister kind of thing. And, that when you brought that term up, that was kind of weird to me. But I don't know. I think it's just shows God's love and just how transcendent he is when we're comparing our thoughts on this subject with his intent for it.
Very good. Very good. I hope that everybody has learned that God is not some old fogey who's trying to steal our fun. I hope that's come through loud and clear, but that God is a good father who delights to give us good gifts, even when those gifts must be protected. He is a good father who loves to give us good gifts. Anybody else? What did you learn about God? Okay, let's go on a blitz here with these myths about sex. Somebody give me your reaction to sex is dirty and shameful. Let me just say again, these are myths or lies. What I'd like you to do is I'd like for you to give me the truth. All right? So the lie is sex is dirty and shameful. Give me the truth.
Sex is beautiful and was created by God.
Amen. It's a God-created and blessed gift. Shame came when sin distorted it. It didn't come with the original package. Shame and sin were not part of God's original package. They came because of sin. All right. Here's the lie. Give me the truth. Casual sex has no consequences. I think even our culture has picked up better than that. But somebody give me the truth.
Casual sex is the reason for most of our problems.
Okay. Sex is very powerful and has many consequences in our world today. And Josh, to say that it's the cause of many of our problems is probably not overstating it. There are physical consequences potentially, like pregnancy or STDs. We know that AIDS is largely transmitted sexually. We don't even hear very much about AIDS anymore, largely because they learned treatments but it can have physical consequences. It can have emotional consequences where a person is tied emotionally to another person and they have a hard time moving on from that person if that relationship is not sustained. There are spiritual consequences of guilt and shame and separation from God. And there are mental consequences. There are lingering memories. There are things that people have a hard time getting past if they do not practice the gift of sex within God's ordained plan. All right, next one. I was waiting to see if anybody had anything additional. It is impossible to control yourself and wait for sex until marriage. I remember watching a teenager being interviewed and asked about this very thing, and she responded almost contemptuously toward the person who asked the question. She said, "You can't really expect us to wait," as though that was a ridiculous thing to ask. So somebody give me the truth.
It is possible and important to follow God's design of not waking love until the proper time.
I love how you incorporated again the words from the Song of Solomon in doing that. I will tell you, after doing lots of premarital counseling over the years, there are some that did not wait, but there are a very good number of people who have waited and practiced abstinence, saving themselves for marriage. And so I think that idea that nobody can wait, that everybody's doing it, puts added pressure on people when the truth is that's not true, that everybody is doing it. There are a number of people who are able to practice intentional saving themselves for their partner, their marriage partner.
And I think that's why it's important to start talking about that with kids when they're young,
Yeah.
and even give scenarios of how are you going to handle this, rather than waiting until they're in that situation and they have to think quick or, oh no, how am I going to get myself out of this mess? Giving them wise counsel on staying out of dark places, being alone, those kind of simple things, talking about it beforehand.
Yeah, we started, our children had questions about sexual things very early. In fact, I remember some coming home from kindergarten and saying, "Dad, what does it mean? I had a little girl tell me today, I want to sex you up."
Kindergarten.
And I said, "Well, let's talk about that a little bit." And so we tried to make it age appropriate. We started talking intentionally with our children. Very planned discussions about the age of 8 for what was age appropriate as we tried to prepare them for adolescence. But I think as they got older and we had those kinds of conversations and we'd bring it up occasionally, what's their reaction? Usually it's kind of like, mom and dad get a room or something like that, quit talking, that kind of stuff.
Roll their eyes.
They kind of roll their eyes now because we talk about it openly. But anyway, it needs to be, again, a healthy, positive kind of things.
I remember something that stuck out with Jared when he was probably in middle school. He heard somebody say that if you kissing somebody and then you end up not marrying them, then you just kiss somebody else's wife. And that stood out to him. And so from that point, he vowed he didn't want to kiss anybody until he was married. They actually had their first kiss at their engagement picture time. So they do listen. They do listen.
Let me just say parenthetically there, when we need to tell our children that when they have that kind of goal themselves, if they're in a dating relationship like Jared was, he needs to communicate that to the person he's dating. Because I think for a long time she felt like she was unattractive to him because he did not initiate the kiss. And she didn't know that that was what was really behind it. So communication again is very important. Marriage solves all sexual temptations. That's the lie that's disappointed many grooms, I think. There are still going to be struggles at times, males particularly with pornography because we're so visual. And so there's the need to address the heart. Temptations deal with what's going on in our heart, and marriage doesn't solve those temptations. Men and women respond the same sexually. That's the lie. What's the truth?
Men are microwaves, women are crock pots.
Very good,
That's
Josh.
good, Josh.
Yeah. Yeah. See, you're showing that there are things that stayed with you, aren't you? We're very different. In fact, in some ways, we seem almost the opposite of one another. And as I told you when we were talking about this, it teaches us to learn how to truly love, because it's in the differences where really the test of love comes about. If someone sees things the same way I do, if someone feels the same way I do, you don't really have to do much loving in that. I mean, that's just, but when somebody sees and does things very differently, that tests your love. And I think that's part of why God made us different. Technical skills are the key to being a good lover. That's the lie. What's the truth?
Making sure that you deeply care about the other person and truly love them is the key to being a good lover and growing together.
And so learning from your spouse, being patient enough, being communicative enough to learn from your spouse what pleases him or her, done in love, that's what being a good lover is about. And the last one is good sex is easy. That's the lie. What's the truth?
Takes time.
All right. It is difficult oftentimes because it takes time, it takes communication, it takes selflessness, it takes submission, it takes love, and all of those things demand something of us. And so it is not easy to do. It would not be one of the 3 top reasons for marital problems if it was easy. So again, that's why classes like this are important. Anybody have any final questions? Remember, this is Dr. Love having a chance to answer your questions. So call in, and what is your question tonight?
Dr. Love, thank you for the class. And I got to tell you, Josh, I'm impressed with your maturity. And Andre and Trent, I'm really impressed with your maturity as a young married couple as well. I don't know you very well at all, but I've been impressed with how you've responded to this. You're
Thank
further
you.
than I ever was.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
They're good ones.
Josh, how old are you?
25.
25.
Yes, ma'am.
Anybody have a question or final comment?
Thanks for putting this class on. I appreciate it. I know my view is completely changed now. And I know I got a long way to go, but I mean, it's completely changed. So thank you. And thank you all for all y'all's inputs. And as a single man, it's been great to hear all of y'all's inputs, and Andrea and Trent, with y'all being pretty close to my age, I appreciate it. And anyway, just thank you all.
Ah, good stuff. Yeah, thank you, Josh. All right. Well, God bless you all. It's been wonderful to be with you, and maybe this will be something that will really bless your life from this point on. I certainly hope so.